32-year-old bachelor Jason Witt appeared to have it all.
I had just finished up my MBA. I had just landed a job with a very good IT consulting firm and was doing really well. I was traveling almost every other week.
But by the summer of 2005, Jason realized one thing was missing: love.
I had come to this realization that I had probably dated a few girls in my past that I could have made a wonderful life with. My own level of commitment didn't allow that relationship to move forward.
He would talk about, what can I do better? How can he make himself a good match for someone?
As Jason plunged back into the dating scene, he was determined to get it right. That August, he joined an online dating site and quickly came across the profile of an attractive 24-year-old medical technician named Andrea Stanley.
Just shot her a quick note just to say, hi, how are you? I'm Jason. And got a response pretty quick.
The conversations that followed revealed clear chemistry.
Andrea had a very engaging writing style. She made me laugh from the get-go. We had an easy time bantering back and forth, so it was enjoyable just talking to her, even though I hadn't heard her voice.
Despite Jason's initial excitement, he did have one concern.
I had never dated someone with a child. Knowing that she had a daughter, I had some questions. I didn't know what that meant in terms of any custody issues.
But Jason didn't have to worry about the father at all. On their first in-person date a few weeks later, Andrea opened up about her past.
There was an ease to our conversation that was really nice and refreshing. So I asked her, where's the father? And her response to me was, I was raped.
He's in jail and he's not a part of her life.
When I heard her say that then, it came out so strong, like such a survivor. It was really impressive.
As the date wrapped up, Jason knew one thing was certain.
There's no doubt it was a great date, and I definitely wanted to see her again.
As 2005 came to a close, their relationship continued to blossom.
We were just kind of taking the natural steps that you'd expect in any serious relationship.
We couldn't be happier.
Me too.
They got along well. She shared his sense of humor. They enjoyed each other's company. That did give me the feeling that they were right for each other.
Then, one night in February 2006, Andrea delivered some unexpected news.
There was an uncomfortable silence, and she simply said, I have something to say. She seemed scared to tell me, and she said,
I'm pregnant.
I was obviously surprised, and I didn't want to make any decisions quickly.
It'll be fine.
But soon it became clear that Andrea wanted answers.
After probably a week and a half, she started asking me questions.
What's up, Jason? It's been 2 weeks.
I said, I am committed to you. I love you. We will have this baby together. Let's see how you and I do, and then we can make decisions that will impact this child long term.
Just one step at a time.
Her response was, either we're getting married or we're not. Getting married when she was showing was not an option. Here was that moment to say yes or no. The decision came down to, yes, I'm in love with her, so I want to marry her.
Jason knew in his heart he was making the right decision. But before Jason could even pop the question, he would be thrown into a vortex of lies, deceit, and manipulation that would destroy everything he believed in.
He was just caught in this whirlwind of emotion.
I can't imagine how someone can keep such a deep, dark secret.
I didn't know what to do, and that's what just scared the dickens out of me.
In April 2006, Jason Witt couldn't be happier to be in love with Andrea Stanley, the future mother of his first child. But that joy was soon shattered when Jason received a distressing call from Andrea while on the road.
She was distraught, she was upset, and she's just, I don't know what's going on.
I lost the baby.
It was devastating.
And that just made me worried for her.
Still, Jason knew what he wanted to do for the woman he loved.
I knew I still felt the way I did about her. I still loved her. I created a get-well bag. At the bottom was a diamond ring she says she had always hoped for.
It's my ring.
Will you marry me?
It was kind of a neat moment to recommit to the two of us.
With the ring on her finger, Andrea quickly bounced back and set a whirlwind date for 2 months later. But by the day of their nuptials, it seemed Andrea had morphed into a classic bridezilla.
She was texting me all kinds of things. She was going to leave me at the altar, and I was a horrible person, and I just didn't know what to do. I felt that she had been under a tremendous amount of stress. She was coming off losing a baby, so I gave her the benefit of the doubt.
I tried to just be positive for Jason and, look forward to a beautiful wedding that day. And fingers crossed that Andrea was actually going to show up.
In the end, Andrea did show up, and the wedding went off without a hitch. But over the next few months, it seemed to Jason that Andrea had a flair for the dramatic.
We had some ups and downs, which I felt was normal. What made me a little bit nervous was one fight in particular. She was just off the roof, angry, and within minutes, turned around like nothing had just happened. It was a real Jekyll and Hyde moment.
Then one night in January 2007, Andrea reached a new low.
Why didn't you respond to my text messages?
I had no idea what was going on. So I started questioning her, why are we always fighting? Where is this coming from? And Andrea started describing her depression.
Jason, I just want to die.
What? I was concerned that she was suffering, having lost a child. I wanted to get her help.
I just want to kill myself.
Jason felt even worse after Andrea revealed that the anniversary of her rape was fast approaching.
We'll get you someone to talk to.
It's too late.
But a few weeks later, Andrea's spirits were lifted.
We find out we were going to have another baby, and we started seeing a doctor, and we knew she was not going to lose the baby. So it really did change the relationship. We were both ecstatic.
Jason was excited to be a father. I could definitely tell that this was something that he always wanted.
By the time she gave birth to their son that November, it seemed Jason and Andrea were finally hitting their stride.
We were both ecstatic. The first time holding my son, it just brought tears to my eyes.
But unfortunately, the upswing didn't last long.
I told you never to do anything like that.
One night, Andrea got upset at a comment that was made by her daughter.
I didn't do anything!
She was in the kitchen, and I just hear a crash.
Go to your room!
Andrea!
I run over, and then there's just broken glass all over the tile floor. She just had a fit of rage, and she just scared the heck out of me. So I said to her,
Give me our son! Give me our son!
Mom!
It's okay, sweetie. You'll be fine. Give me our son!
she would not hand me the baby.
With no other choice, Jason called the police, which caused Andrea to pack both kids in the car and take off.
At that point, I had no idea what she was capable of.
It was just the tip of the iceberg.
On May 2nd, 2008, Jason Witt called the police after his wife Andrea flew into a terrifying rage and took off with the kids.
I was scared because I had no idea what she was capable of. The cops picked her up a couple miles into the next county.
But Andrea told police she'd merely been taking the children to dinner.
She had kind of charmed herself out of any sort of consequences. I was beginning to learn at this point that she could lie. She could lie fairly easily, readily, and people were going to believe her. I began to question the reality of the stories that she told me early on in our marriage. And I'd begun to wonder whether or not she had really been raped.
And by December 2008, Jason was even more certain that his instinct was right.
We had an argument.
And Andrea had gone home to her parents, and her mom called me. And so my question to her mom was,
Did she ever get any help after her rape?
her mom's response was, huh? And I said, she was not raped, was she? And her mom's response was, you need to speak to Andrea.
When Andrea finally returned home later that night, Jason did just that.
We need to talk.
She said to me, I was married.
I didn't want you to find out.
She told me that he did rape her, but she told me that he was the son of a prominent person in town. Her parents pressured her into marrying him anyway.
Jason didn't believe a word she said.
The dam broke because everything I believed about this woman was a lie.
But despite it all, Jason wanted to somehow save the marriage. He believed that counseling was the best next step.
I was shocked. I was very vocal with Jason in telling him that she was not going to change. But Jason was committed to the relationship.
Things were good for at least a couple weeks, and she got pregnant again. I was happy, but Andrea could never follow through with counseling. So that was when I realized that I don't have a partner in this. This isn't a marriage if there's only one person fighting for it.
With that, Jason felt there was only one thing to do.
Leaving a pregnant woman was not an easy decision for me at all.
On September 4th, 2009, after 3 years of marriage, Jason filed for divorce. He hoped the worst was behind him, but he was wrong.
The day I filed for divorce was the day I basically set off a nuclear bomb.
After giving birth to a second son, Andrea fought tooth and nail to keep their children from Jason. For over 2 years, a custody battle of epic proportions played out between the two of them.
Jason and Andrea were basically sharing custody. She initiated 6 false allegations of child abuse against him, with Child Protective Services alleging all manner of child abuse. She initiated 2 or 3 police investigations against him as well.
Every month I was dealing with a new accusation. I was dealing with accusations just left and right. This was just a harrowing experience, because when you're dealing with children, all she had to do was cry wolf, and the courts were going to believe her.
But when all allegations against Jason were proven false, a judge finally held Andrea in contempt and ordered her to allow visitation immediately.
I knew that Andrea was backed into a corner. For the first time, someone of authority had let her know that there were truly consequences to all this stuff that she was doing.
Over the next several weeks, Jason was surprised to hear very little from his ex.
There were no accusations. It was just quiet. And it felt good. It was her weekend to have the kids. So I dropped off the kids with Andrea, and I met some friends, and we went out and watched the Super Bowl. After getting home, I just went straight to my bedroom, and I just crashed.
But around 4 a.m., something stirred him from his sleep.
I remember hearing a shuffle right next to my bed, and I felt a crack right against my head. I can't see, it's dark, I don't know what's going on, and a big pop went off. And at that moment, I knew whoever it was had a gun.
And what he saw next would send his world spiraling out of control.
I was letting out whatever sound I could, and it was just a shriek.
In the early morning hours of February 6th, 2012, Jason Witt found himself under attack.
I knew whoever it was had a gun, so I flipped the light on.
Andrea!
And Andrea is standing there, staring me down. My head was racing. I'm just wired at this point, adrenaline just running like crazy.
Turn over.
Andrea grabbed my hands and started to tie them up with plexi ties, and then began to pull the bed sheets off the bed and wrap them around me.
Andrea! No! You're gonna kill me!
I'm not gonna kill you, Jason. I love you. Stop struggling.
I couldn't breathe, and I could feel the plexi cuffs just loosening just that little bit. Eventually, I just pulled my arms out of the plexi cuffs, put a hole through the saran wrap. I started going after her, and the gun goes off. She was trying to shove her way into the room, so I started hitting her over the head with the gun. I shut the door and I locked it and called 911. I told them my ex-wife broke in. She tried to kill me. I need help. I don't know if she's still in the house. I don't know what's going on, but I need help. I need an ambulance and I need police here quick.
As police arrived, Andrea was nowhere to be found, and Jason was rushed to the emergency room. He had no clue until he arrived at the hospital that he'd been shot point blank in the face.
The bullet went through my cheek, under my ear, and out my neck, and didn't hit anything major. It's an absolute miracle.
Meanwhile, police located Andrea at a different hospital almost 4 hours away.
She told sheriff's deputies that she had been a victim of domestic violence, that her husband had beaten her with a gun.
She made claims that it was not her fault and that she was defending herself. Even after committing this horrible attack and then getting arrested at the hospital, Andrea was still lying.
It was shocking to me that she thought anyone would believe it.
Fortunately, all of Andrea's previous actions against Jason spoke volumes.
She was placed under arrest for aggravated assault for causing serious bodily injury with a deadly weapon.
Only a sick person can do this kind of thing. To walk in and torture him. God knows what her plan was. I mean, it's got to be the utmost evil.
On May 14th, 2013, Andrea went to trial, claiming she was a victim of domestic violence. But prosecutors were confident with the trail Andrea herself had left behind.
One of Andrea's boyfriends testified about the things that she had done with him that were very, very similar to what Jason had gone through. There was also evidence from a psychiatrist that she was a habitual liar. There was clear proof that Andrea had a disturbing pattern of terrorizing the men in her life.
I think Andrea is a very miserable, sad, sick individual. And it's just sad that her demons really ran so deep, she couldn't overcome them.
After 2 days of testimony, Andrea Stanley was convicted on all counts and was sentenced to 50 years in prison.
There was just a huge sense of relief. It just felt like 8 years of absolute hell was finally over.
Today, Jason continues to question everything he ever knew about Andrea.
I keep wondering how all this happened.
I mean, there isn't a single word that she ever told me that I can truly rely on as honest truth.
And when he thinks about committing to a relationship, Jason keeps his focus on the people who matter most.
Jason has really stepped up. He is a full-time single dad. I think this has really turned him into a stronger person for the long run.
The boys and I are catching up on what we missed out on. And it's been just unbelievable to watch the kids grow, to have them come out of this situation, especially my oldest. That little kid is my hero. I can't look back on the last couple of years of the time I've spent with my boys without anything but
complete joy.
After being adopted as a baby, Rachel Shubin felt like she had always been searching for her place in the world.
I always knew I was adopted, so it wasn't shattering, but it wasn't a good childhood. They moved a lot, my adopted family, so I was always the new kid. I felt like I didn't belong.
Rachel dreamed of settling down and having a family of her own someday.
She always wanted a stable family, something that she didn't have when she was growing up.
And in the winter of 1994, while on break from college, a chance meeting in California was about to put 18-year-old Rachel's dream in motion.
I came up to West Sacramento, my hometown, to visit my adopted family. And I went and picked up my mother coffee from the grocery store.
At the cash register, Sergio Alvarez packed up her purchases, and Rachel couldn't help but recognize him from her high school class.
Sergio, right?
Sergio's very, very popular, got along really well with everyone. He was even homecoming king.
Rachel was floored when Sergio followed her out to her car and asked for her number.
So I was super flattered. This good-looking man asked me to go out with him.
It's the real number.
A few days later, the two went out for dinner. And afterward, Rachel felt herself being swept off her feet.
We went back to his house, and he played the keyboard for me. Told me he couldn't breathe without me. It was so sweet and romantic.
She found him to be very endearing and big and attractive, and it didn't take them long to fall in love.
Sergio had this giant family. I liked that he had these roots. It was the family that I'd always wanted.
The only thing that seemed off was the way Sergio shied away from intimacy.
Sergio wasn't as affectionate as I thought was normal. I just thought that was his DNA. Everyone's different.
Despite Sergio's lack of affection, Rachel knew she had met the man of her dreams. A few months after they started dating, Rachel dropped out of school and moved in with Sergio in Sacramento.
I felt like maybe because I had had such a rocky childhood that God gave me Sergio. He made Sergio for me.
With marriage in mind, Rachel got a job managing a local gift shop, and the young couple began saving money for their future. But after 2 years, they hit a speed bump when Sergio lost his job at the grocery store for constantly showing up late.
He had started getting write-ups and warnings. And so after 3, they fired him.
It wasn't my fault.
You're right.
But Sergio quickly landed on his feet when one of his friends hooked him up with a job on a ranch for troubled teens.
They needed guidance counselors, men that live there, and give them the rules and to get them used to structure, discipline. He loved that job.
The only problem was that the ranch was in Nevada, 7 hours away.
But he was gone 8 days and home 6 days. And when he's at work, he's not available. I've never minded being alone, but it was hard to be in a relationship with someone far away a lot.
With Sergio gone so much, Rachel became close to a woman who worked nearby named Kate.
She helped Kate out when Kate was working. She would watch Kate's children.
Rachel was eager for Sergio to meet her new friend, so on one of his weeks at home, Rachel invited Kate over for the evening.
It's so much fun, guys.
But later that night, Sergio made a disturbing confession to Rachel.
Your friend Kate came on to me.
Sergio tells Rachel that Kate came on to him and tried to kiss him.
She'd made a pass at him, and he had said that she called me a bitch and said,
Why You could do so much better.
So I felt super betrayed.
I just can't believe that. That's right.
But when Rachel confronted her friend, she heard a very different version of the story.
According to Kate, it was the other way around. Sergio tried to unbutton her blouse and tried to go even further.
He came on to me.
Rachel wasn't sure who to believe.
My friends said, she's crazy, she just wants him.
I would have thought, no way, she probably came on to him. Sergio was just an all-around good person.
I ended up believing Sergio.
But Rachel would soon find out that Sergio was far from the knight in shining armor he pretended to be.
Underneath it all, he was evil.
He was psychologically off.
He threw away a good life to be a monster.
I knew it.
In their 4 years together, Rachel Shubin and Sergio Alvarez had faced their share of challenges. Then, in the fall of 1998, Sergio came home from his job on a ranch in Nevada with more bad news.
What's going on? What happened?
Lost my job.
He said that a boy had made an allegation that he was too rough in one of the restraining moves that they were allowed to make on kids when they became out of hand.
Rachel, it was not my fault, all right?
Sergio was let go, and Rachel decided to just be glad he was home.
I was so relieved that he wasn't going to be gone all the time.
Luckily, someone in Sergio's large network of friends quickly helped him land a new job delivering baked goods in the neighborhood.
He's coming home at 3 p.m. every day. The job was perfect for that time in our life. I couldn't have been happier.
In the fall of 1999, almost 5 years after they started dating, Sergio and Rachel finally wed. Within a year, the newlyweds welcomed a baby girl, and 2 years later, Rachel was pregnant again with a little boy. Sergio had given Rachel the family she'd always dreamed of.
They seemed very happy. Sergio seemed like a great father. He was always protective, always present.
But when no one was looking, that Sergio vanished.
But he was not attentive. He wasn't responsible. That attitude, it was very hard for me with the kids. They needed a responsible father.
In 2004, Rachel learned she was expecting baby number 3. Although Sergio was rarely around to help out at home, she was happy that he was at least supporting them financially. Until one day that fall, when Sergio told Rachel that his supervisor at the delivery company was unhappy with his performance.
He's being warned. He didn't take it seriously, so they suspended him. And then after careful review, decided not to bring him back.
How many times is this gonna happen?
All Rachel could think about was how they were going to get by. But Sergio had a plan.
Sergio came up with the idea of going into the police academy. He thought he could make a difference in the community. It was something he really wanted to do.
In 2007, Sergio officially became a member of the West Sacramento Police Department. He immediately put in for night patrol.
He liked working the graveyard shift. He liked catching the bad guys.
But working nights didn't ensure that Sergio spent his days with his family.
I started to notice that he was absent a lot more.
Sergio often claimed he was being called in to testify on his cases. And the extra hours were beginning to take their toll.
Rachel, what is this?
He became mean all the time. He'd bait me into arguments. I can't do anything right. It was just impossible to please him.
Rachel felt instinctually that something was off, and one night in March 2010, she discovered why.
A woman messaged me, and I didn't know who this lady was.
The woman claimed that Sergio had been deceiving Rachel, and this time, there was a shocking set of facts that not even Sergio could deny.
I'm devastated because it's true. This is real.
Look me in the eye, Sergio. Is it true?
In 2010, Rachel Alvarez received a shocking message from a woman she'd never met.
Even though I didn't know her, she said that she couldn't stand that I was being subjected to so much behind my back. She had to do the right thing. She said that Sergio was having an affair.
The woman said that Sergio had been romantically involved with one of her friends for over a year.
She had dates and times and situations that she wouldn't know unless what she was telling me were in fact true.
When Rachel confronted Sergio, he reluctantly admitted to the affair.
You're sorry.
My heart was broken.
It's been going on for a year?
He was very remorseful, said he loved only me. I'm devastated because it's true, this is real.
It'll never happen again.
Rachel struggled with what she should do, eventually deciding to put her family first and believe her husband.
That was her family structure, and that was so very important to her. So she wanted to try to make it work with him.
I wanted to give him the chance. I was willing to work past it. I loved him very much.
So over the next few months, Rachel did her best to put the past behind her and focus on her family.
He did seem to try. So I thought it was on the right track.
But by 2011, after 17 years together, it seemed to get more and more difficult to keep Sergio content, especially in the bedroom.
It seemed for him to get physical satisfaction, he had to be very aggressive. I thought he had like a guilty complex because of the affair. And so this is what it would take for him to be satisfied.
Sergio, bring him.
Rachel justified that as being, this is what my husband needs from me. This is what a wife does for her husband. I said, that doesn't seem normal, doesn't seem right to me.
Rachel did her best to please her husband until September 2012, when Sergio came home with some devastating news.
He opens up his wallet, and there's this groove where your badge goes. And I'm like, where's your badge? And he said, they put me on paid admin leave. A girl made an allegation.
They're accusing me of things that had nothing to do with me.
Sergio said that a woman he'd encountered on patrol had accused him of forcing himself on her.
Some to the effect that if she didn't grope him, that he would cite her. I'd give her a ticket. He said the Police Officer Association protects their officers from allegations like this because they are normal in this line of work. Why would he force someone to do something? It's very out there.
Rachel was relieved by Sergio's explanation and hoped the incident would be resolved soon. Until Sergio was unexpectedly called into the station.
I'm thinking, oh, is he in trouble? Then my doorbell rings.
Yes.
There were 6 or 7 patrol units in front of my house. I was in shock.
What is going on?
Rachel may have thought her marriage had hit rock bottom, but the real nightmare was only just beginning.
You think you know someone, but you really don't.
He would put that uniform on, and he got carried away with the power.
I think he just snapped.
In September 2012, Rachel Alvarez was horrified as an army of investigators descended on her home.
They had a search warrant with specified items that a judge had signed and given them permission to obtain. I was so terrified.
They took all of their cell phones, their computers, tablets, anything that had any kind of communication technology.
When Sergio returned, he told Rachel the allegations were more serious than he originally thought.
What's going on? What now?
They've taken DNA from him. I did not know what to think. This is all new, scary territory for me.
And after 2 months with no word from investigators, Sergio finally sat Rachel down and showed her something shocking.
It was a link to sex addiction in police officers. He told me, I'm a sex addict.
I could be in a lot of trouble.
Sergio admitted he'd had many affairs during their marriage.
There's been a lot of them.
He also told her that the current police investigation hanging over his head was serious.
Please don't leave him.
Rachel was torn.
I loved him. I have a sense of loyalty to him. I don't want to be his wife, but I don't want to turn my back on him either.
Rachel reluctantly agreed to stand by him. And later that night, she tried to learn everything she could about Sergio's addiction.
In doing research to sex addiction, there are links to sexual predators' behavior. And that's when I read My Husband in Black and White.
Something clicked in her head. Looking back, she could see the different traits.
With every word, Rachel's eyes were open to the reality she'd been living in, and she thought back to Sergio's lack of intimacy and aggressiveness in bed.
But I also began to remember the allegations from early in our relationship from Kate.
He came on to me.
And thought there might actually be substance to it. So I started thinking he really was a sexual predator. That's the moment I started fearing him. I knew I needed to get out.
Over the next few months, Rachel quietly formulated a plan. And on January 3rd, 2013, she told Sergio she was taking the children out for the day. But instead, she packed up the car and fled to Florida.
She had to be scared to take her kids, drive all the way across the country. Only fear can drive a woman to do that.
And Rachel escaped not a moment too soon. 2 months later, Sergio was indicted on 35 counts, including aggravated kidnapping, rape, sexual penetration, and oral copulation by use of authority and duress.
A woman came forward and said that she had been picked up by him and felt threatened to the point that she felt she needed to perform sexual favors in exchange for not going to jail.
Eventually, investigators linked him to 5 more victims.
The charges were more than I could wrap my mind around. I was physically ill for 2 weeks.
At his trial in February 2014, Sergio pleaded not guilty, claiming the women's stories couldn't be trusted. But the prosecution argued that Sergio was a sexual predator who used his badge to hunt his victims.
He would check the system for active warrants and pick names of women that he felt he could victimize. He'd take them in his car to some remote locations, wooded lots, back alleys, and they would have sex.
Do me this favor, you won't go to jail.
With DNA and victim testimony, there was no denying the truth.
The physical evidence was overwhelming, and I was just in shock.
After 2 weeks of testimony and 9 days of deliberations, Sergio Alvarez was found guilty of 25 felony counts of rape, oral copulation by duress, and aggravated kidnapping. He was sentenced to 205 years in prison.
Sergio put that uniform on, and he got carried away with the power that he had and used it against these women.
You can't prepare yourself for the father of your children and the man you give 18 years of your life to be a monster. I think there was something always wrong with Sergio. I think he just snapped.
Today, Rachel's focus is on her children.
Sergio was like a firestorm that destroyed the home I built for my children and the roots that I'd always wanted for them. It's always going to be hard. But my children ground me.
It's a tough road, but she's still standing and she's not going down, and she's going to be there for her children.
Rachel is now content to have stepped out of Sergio's shadow and into her own future.
I don't feel sorry for myself. And I'm not ashamed of myself. I'm ashamed of him. I'm not going to be a victim. I'm going to be a survivor.
The year is 1921, a period of profound transition and deep, underlying friction on the remote, lush islands of American Samoa. Situated in the vast, unfathomable expanse of the South Pacific Ocean, this territory is experiencing the very dawn of a rigid, foreign administrative era. The United States government, seeking to solidify its influence and strategic foothold in the region, has begun to systematically impose its own complex structure of Western jurisprudence upon a land that has, for countless generations, functioned seamlessly under the profound and ancient tenets of indigenous tradition. This is a time of immense historical consequence, a delicate and dangerous intersection where the inflexible, codified statutes of American law collide silently but violently with the deeply ingrained, unspoken rules of tribal psychology, chiefly authority, and the supreme importance of personal and communal honor. It is within this fragile atmosphere of cultural collision, where the old world is being rapidly subjugated by the new, that a devastating tragedy unfolds, culminating in a demonstration of judicial power so rapid and severe that it would ultimately echo all the way to the halls of power in Washington. Our story begins not in a courtroom or a government office, but in the dense, suffocatingly humid darkness of a small, isolated settlement known as Vaitogi Village. The atmosphere is heavy with the salt spray of the Pacific Ocean, the rhythmic, relentless sound of the crashing waves providing a constant, murmuring backdrop to the nocturnal activities of the island. It is an environment where the boundaries between the physical world and the ancestral traditions are thin, and where the actions of a single night can irreparably alter the fabric of a community. In a secluded, dimly lit corner of this village, beneath the flickering, unsteady glow of a rudimentary oil lamp, the seeds of a brutal and deeply personal conflict are being sown. The meager light casts long, distorted shadows against the walls, creating an environment of claustrophobia and mounting tension. The air is thick with the smell of burning oil, the earthy scent of the surrounding vegetation, and the palpable, nervous energy of men engaged in a high-stakes game of chance. The quiet, repetitive rattle of dice rolling across a rudimentary surface serves as the heartbeat of this fatal encounter, a sound that will soon be permanently eclipsed by the deafening roar of a shotgun. At the center of this fateful gathering are two men whose differing backgrounds and contrasting fortunes will serve as the catalyst for an unprecedented sequence of events. The victim in this unfolding tragedy is a man named Sake. He is an outsider to Vaitogi, having traveled from the neighboring region of Leon. Sake is a man of experience, worldly in the context of the islands, and on this particular night, he is the undisputed victor. He is a man who has come to Vaitogi and systematically dismantled his opponent's fortunes, accumulating a significant and insurmountable concentration of wealth from the frantic, desperate wagers placed before him. As a human being, Sake is simply participating in a widely accepted, albeit risky, social activity, unaware that his continued success and his subsequent behavior will seal his ultimate demise. He is riding the intoxicating wave of victory, an emotional high that perhaps blinds him to the dangerous psychological precipice upon which his opponent is teetering. Sake is a man whose life is about to be abruptly and violently extinguished, not because of a grand conspiracy or a deep-seated, generational feud, but due to the immediate, toxic combination of gambling, pride, and a fatal miscalculation of human desperation. Opposite him sits the perpetrator, Topu, a young, impulsive native of Vaitogi. Topu is a product of his environment, a young man who carries within him the immense, invisible weight of Samoan pride and the absolute necessity of maintaining face within his community. For Topu, the concept of honor is not a mere abstract philosophical idea. It is the very foundation of his identity and his standing among his peers. As the night drags on and the dice continually fall out of his favor, Topo finds himself completely bankrupted, his resources utterly depleted. He is drowning in a catastrophic, mounting debt that far exceeds any realistic capacity he possesses for repayment. The financial ruin, however, is merely the physical manifestation of a much deeper, more agonizing psychological destruction. The true tragedy lies in the social dynamics of the interaction. Sake, emboldened by his absolute victory and perhaps lacking the necessary restraint or empathy for his defeated opponent, does not merely demand the money he is owed. He chooses to vocalize his dominance, actively humiliating Topu in the presence of the other village residents. He hurls insults that cut far deeper than the loss of physical currency. For a young, proud man deeply entrenched in the native customs of Eitogi, this is an unforgivable transgression. To be utterly defeated financially is a heavy burden, but to be stripped of one's dignity, to be actively mocked and degraded before one's own people by a man from an entirely different region, is an unbearable devastation of the soul. The humiliation acts as a potent, immediate poison, eroding Topa's rationality and replacing his desperation with a blinding, all-consuming fury. He is pushed into a psychological corner, a dark and dangerous space where all alternative avenues of resolution seem to vanish, leaving only the singular, catastrophic imperative to reclaim his stolen honor through an act of supreme violence. As the gambling session concludes and the men disperse into the heavy, tropical night, the damage has been irreversibly inflicted. Sake, perhaps believing the incident to be nothing more than the typical, heated conclusion of a competitive game, begins his journey back toward Lyon, entirely oblivious to the lethal intentions he has inadvertently awakened. The environment around him is profoundly still, the deafening chorus of nocturnal insects momentarily pausing as if in dark anticipation of the violence to come. The southern hemisphere moon casts long, skeletal shadows through the dense canopy of the coconut groves, creating a labyrinth of darkness and fleeting light. It is a setting of profound natural beauty, a tranquil, isolated environment that is entirely incongruous with the brutal, calculated act of murder that is about to occur within its borders. Driven by a combination of profound shame and lethal determination, Topo does not retire to his home to accept his defeat. Instead, he quietly and deliberately secures a shotgun, transforming himself from a humiliated debtor into an active, stalking predator. The transformation is absolute. He utilizes his intimate knowledge of the local terrain, slipping seamlessly into the oppressive darkness of the night. Topo shadows his target with lethal patience, tracking Sake as the unsuspecting man navigates the narrow, uneven pathways winding through the towering, silent coconut trees. The young man's impulsive nature has crystallized into a terrifying, singular focus. The perceived necessity of restoring his honor has completely overridden any consideration for human life, any thought of the terrible consequences, or any fear of the newly established American legal apparatus that now claims ultimate jurisdiction over the island. The climax of this personal vendetta occurs in the deepest shadows of the grove. The distance between the two men closes. Topo steps out from the enveloping darkness, raising the heavy, cold steel of the shotgun. At point-blank range, a terrifying proximity that leaves absolutely no margin for error or escape, he pulls the trigger. A thunderous, catastrophic explosion violently shatters the profound silence of the night, echoing through the coconut trees and across the crashing waves of the Pacific. The devastating blast strikes Sake squarely in the chest, inflicting massive, unsurvivable trauma. The victim, a man who just moments prior was reveling in his financial triumph, collapses instantly onto the damp earth, his life abruptly and brutally terminated among the roots of the palm trees. The echoes of that single, catastrophic gunshot signal the end of Sake's life, but they simultaneously ignite the terrifying machinery of a foreign justice system eager to assert its absolute dominance. The subsequent events unfold with a dizzying, terrifying velocity. A massive, coordinated manhunt is immediately mobilized by the combined forces of the Naval Administration and local police, sweeping across the rugged terrain, the dense forests, and the protective, familial networks of the island. For 11 agonizing days, Topa manages to evade capture, existing as a fugitive in his own homeland, a hunted man living on borrowed time as the net of American authorities systematically tightens around him. His eventual capture marks the beginning of an entirely new, deeply disturbing phase of this narrative. The legal proceedings that follow are not characterized by the careful, deliberate pursuit of truth, but rather by an extreme, almost desperate urgency to demonstrate power. Topu is swiftly absorbed into an alien, mechanical judicial process that is entirely foreign to the island's traditional methods of conflict resolution. He is rapidly processed, judged, and condemned with a speed that defies logical comprehension. The historical record reveals a timeline that is deeply unsettling, from the moment the shotgun blast echoed through the Vaitogi coconut grove to the moment a hangman's noose is secured around Topa's neck. An astonishingly brief period of merely 26 days elapses. He is sentenced to the gallows, forever marking the history books as the recipient of a very first execution by hanging in the history of the territory. This astonishingly rapid execution is not an isolated, ignored event. The extreme velocity of the process, the complete absence of any realistic opportunity for a thorough appeal, and the sheer, unyielding severity of the punishment trigger intense shockwaves that reach far beyond the shores of the South Pacific. The proceedings are so blatantly accelerated, so overtly designed as a brutal demonstration of colonial authority rather than a measured pursuit of justice, that they incite outrage thousands of miles away. A lawyer residing in the state of California, upon learning of the circumstances surrounding this rapid-fire jurisprudence, is moved to take extraordinary action. Incensed by what he perceives as a gross violation of fundamental legal rights and a grotesque parody of due process, this distant observer drafts an urgent, passionate letter of protest, addressing it directly to the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge. This communication highlights the profound, deeply troubling themes that elevate this case from a simple tale of murder to a complex, dark examination of imperial power. The central, haunting question remains, was the swift and brutal elimination of Topu 26 days after the crime a genuine effort to secure justice for a murdered man from Leon, or was it a cold, calculated, and terrifying political maneuver utilized by a fledgling colonial administration desperate to terrify a native population into complete and absolute submission? To fully comprehend the magnitude of the tragedy that unfolded in the darkness of Vaitogi, it is absolutely essential to first step back and examine the complex, rapidly shifting world in which these men lived, and to closely understand the man who would ultimately lose his life in the coconut grove. The year 1921 in American Samoa was not merely a point on a calendar, it was a profound temporal threshold, a period characterized by an intense and largely unspoken friction between two vastly different ways of existing. To understand the victim, Sake, and the horrific fate that awaited him, one must first understand the ground upon which he walked. For centuries, the Samoan archipelago had been governed by an intricate, deeply rooted system of chiefly authority and communal social structures known as Fa Samoa, or the Samoan Way. This was a sophisticated, unwritten code of conduct that dictated everything from land ownership and dispute resolution to the incredibly delicate balance of personal honor, family standing, and social obligation. Under this ancient system, harmony was maintained through consensus, and transgressions were typically addressed through mediation, restitution, and the profound social weight of the village council. However, the dawn of the 20th century had brought an abrupt and permanent disruption to this ancestral rhythm. Following international treaties at the turn of the century, the eastern islands of the Samoan archipelago had been placed under the direct administrative control of the United States Navy. By 1921, this naval administration was no longer a distant, abstract concept. It was an increasingly visible and assertive force determined to establish absolute order according to the rigid, codified principles of Western jurisprudence. The American authorities brought with them a system of laws, courts, and punitive measures that were entirely alien to the native population. They sought to replace the nuanced, restorative justice of the tribal chiefs with the cold, adversarial, and punitive mechanics of the American legal system. This transition was far from smooth. It created an atmosphere of profound cultural dislocation and underlying tension. The native Samoans found themselves caught in a precarious existence, forced to navigate the deeply ingrained expectations of their ancestral traditions while simultaneously trying to understand and avoid the harsh, uncompromising grip of the new foreign laws. It is within this incredibly volatile atmosphere, a world caught halfway between the ancient power of the village chiefs and the looming shadow of the naval prison, that the lives of Sake and Topu would fatally intersect. The geography of this encounter is equally crucial to understanding the underlying dynamics of the crime. Sake was not a native of Eitogi, the village where he would meet his violent end. He hailed from Lyon, a distinction that carried significant cultural and historical weight on the island of Tutuila. Lyon was not just another settlement, it was a place of historical prominence. Located on the southwestern coast of the island, Lyon had long been a crucial center of religious and political activity. It was one of the earliest and most significant landing sites for Christian missionaries in the 19th century, and it had subsequently developed into a relatively bustling, interconnected hub of local commerce and administration. A man from Lyon was, in the context of the island's microgeography, a man of the world. He was likely more accustomed to the presence of foreigners, more integrated into the shifting economic realities of the territory, and perhaps possessed a certain degree of cosmopolitan confidence that came from residing in a historically significant and connected region. Lyon was a place that looked outward, a community that had long engaged with the changing tides of history. In stark contrast to the historical prominence of Lyon stood the village of Eitogi. Situated on a rugged, relentlessly battered stretch of the southern coastline, Eitogi was a community defined by its isolation and its profound connection to the raw, untamed forces of nature. It was a place steeped in ancient mythology, a village where the crashing waves of the Pacific Ocean constantly reshaped the jagged volcanic cliffs. The people of Eitogi were known for their fierce independence and their deep, unyielding adherence to local traditions. It was a community that looked inward, deeply protective of its own internal hierarchies and deeply suspicious of outside influence. When Sake traveled from Lyon to Eitogi, he was not merely crossing a few miles of tropical terrain, he was crossing a subtle but profound cultural boundary. He was entering an insular environment where he was distinctly recognized as an outsider. This dynamic, the worldly, confident man from the historical center entering the isolated, deeply traditional stronghold, created an invisible but palpable imbalance of power from the moment he arrived. Sake carried with him the implicit swagger of his home region, an aura of experience and shrewdness that would ultimately serve to exacerbate the fatal tensions of the evening. Who was Sake, the man destined to die violently in the shadows? While the official historical records from the period are often stark and clinical, focusing primarily on the mechanics of the crime rather than the humanity of the victim, we can piece together a psychological portrait based on his actions and his background. Sake was clearly a man comfortable with risk. To leave the familiar confines of Lyon and travel to an insular village like Eitogi for the express purpose of engaging in high-stakes gambling requires a specific type of personality. He was a man who trusted his own instincts, a man who believed in his ability to navigate the complex social dynamics of a foreign village and emerge victorious. In the dimly lit, smoke-filled corner of Eitogi where the fateful game took place, Sake would have been a commanding presence. He was not a victim who stumbled blindly into a trap. He was an active, willing participant in a dangerous game of chance, confident in his own superiority. As the night progressed and the dice rolled continuously in his favor, Sake's confidence would have inevitably swelled into a dangerous sense of invulnerability. We must understand the psychology of the gambler on a winning streak. It is an intoxicating, blinding experience. The continuous accumulation of wealth, especially in a setting where resources are scarce and highly valued, creates a powerful surge of adrenaline and a false sense of omnipotence. Sake was not merely winning money, He was systematically stripping his opponent of his resources, asserting his dominance with every successful wager. He was a man riding the crest of a wave, completely absorbed in the immediate gratification of his victory. However, this intoxication proved to be his fatal flaw. In his singular focus on the mechanics of the game and the growing pile of winnings before him, Sake completely lost sight of the human element sitting across from him. He failed to read the room. He failed to recognize the subtle, terrifying shift in the atmosphere as the game transitioned from a friendly competition into a devastating humiliation. To Sake, a man perhaps more accustomed to the transactional nature of the larger settlements, the game was simply about the exchange of wealth. When he won, he expected to collect his earnings. When Topu, his young and increasingly desperate opponent, found himself completely bankrupted and unable to pay the massive debt he had incurred, Sake reacted with the predictable frustration of a creditor. But he went further. Emboldened by his victory and blinded by his own arrogance, Sake chose to press his advantage in the most destructive way possible. He did not simply demand his money. He weaponized his victory. He began to vocalize his dominance, hurling insults and derogatory remarks at Topu. He chose to publicly shame the young man, loudly broadcasting Topu's financial ruin and his inability to honor his debts to the surrounding onlookers. For Sake, this may have seemed like nothing more than the sharp, customary banter of the gambling circle, a final exertion of dominance before collecting his spoils and returning home. He viewed the insults as a tool to extract payment, entirely unaware that he was actually forging the weapon of his own destruction. Sake's fundamental, fatal mistake was his catastrophic misunderstanding of the environment he was in and the specific psychological makeup of the man he was humiliating. He was treating a deeply traditional, fiercely proud native of Veitogi as if he were just another indebted gambler in a bustling port town. He failed to comprehend that in the deeply interwoven social fabric of a village like Veitogi, personal honor was not a luxury, it was the absolute core of a man's existence. Under the tenets of Fa Samoa, a man's reputation, his standing within his family, and his face within the community were paramount. To be financially ruined was a severe hardship, but it was a hardship that could potentially be managed through the support of extended family. However, to be publicly verbally decimated, to have one's dignity stripped away by an outsider from Lyon in front of one's own peers, was an entirely different matter. It was a social death sentence. It was a transgression that penetrated far deeper than any financial debt. As Sake stood there in the flickering lamplight, his pockets heavy with his winnings, his voice cutting through the humid night air with words of derision, he had no idea that he had crossed an invisible, irreversible line. He was a man entirely comfortable in his perceived dominance, completely oblivious to the fact that his actions had triggered a profound psychological collapse in his opponent. He looked at Topu and saw only a defeated, penniless young man who owed him money. He did not see the intense, suffocating shame that was rapidly metastasizing into a lethal, uncontrollable rage. Sake's tragedy is rooted in this absolute blindness. He was a man of the world, experienced and shrewd, yet he possessed a fatal blind spot when it came to understanding the raw, uncompromising nature of pride in the isolated corners of the island. When the gambling session finally concluded and the men began to disperse, Sake's fate was already sealed, though he remained blissfully ignorant of the fact. He prepared for the long walk back to Lyon, carrying with him the physical spoils of his victory and the arrogant satisfaction of a man who had conquered his opponent. He stepped out into the oppressive darkness of the Veitogi night, leaving the flickering safety of the lamps behind him. He walked toward the dense, silent canopy of the coconut groves, his mind likely preoccupied with the wealth he had accumulated and the life that awaited him back home. He was a man walking away from a triumph, entirely unaware that he was actually walking directly into an execution. The tragic irony of Sake's final moments lies in this profound disconnect. He was a man who felt completely alive, completely victorious, and completely secure, utterly failing to realize that his own words, his own arrogance, and his own catastrophic failure to understand the deeply rooted honor system of his opponent had transformed the quiet, tropical night into a meticulously designed death trap. The transformation of Topu from a humiliated, bankrupt debtor into a calculating, lethal predator was not an instantaneous explosion of rage, but a chillingly cold, methodical descent into a singular, dark purpose. As the gambling session in the dimly lit corner of Vaitogi village dissolved, the atmosphere shifted from the frantic, high-pitched energy of the game to a suffocating, heavy silence that seemed to press down on the very earth. Topu did not linger in the presence of his peers, nor did he attempt to negotiate the staggering debt he had incurred. Instead, he retreated into the shadows of the village, his movements deliberate, quiet, and increasingly detached from the reality of his surroundings. The humiliation he had suffered at the hands of Sake was not just an external affront. It had carved a deep, jagged canyon within his psyche, fundamentally altering his perception of his own identity and his standing among the people of Vaitogi. The insults hurled by the outsider from Lyon had acted as a final, catastrophic catalyst, systematically dismantling the social and psychological barriers that might otherwise have prevented him from crossing the irreversible boundary into murder. In the solitude of his home, or perhaps within the deeper, darker recesses of the village, Topu made his preparations. This was not the act of a man gripped by a temporary, chaotic frenzy, but rather the cold, systematic planning of an executioner. He sought out a shotgun, an implement of death that held a terrifying, singular utility in the island's landscape. The weapon was more than a tool. It was a symbol of the lethal, destructive power that he was about to exert, a physical manifestation of his desperate, warped need to reclaim the honor that had been stripped from him. As he handled the cold, heavy steel of the gun, confirming its function and preparing its lethal load, the reality of his intentions became absolute. Any lingering doubts, any moral hesitations, or any fleeting thoughts of the consequences were systematically extinguished by the absolute, all-consuming furnace of his shame. He was no longer a young man struggling with a bad roll of the dice. He was a man on a mission, fueled by a distorted, uncompromising, and deeply entrenched sense of righteous indignation. The night outside was a living, breathing entity, indifferent to the violent collision that was about to occur within its borders. The air was heavy with the thick, cloying scent of tropical vegetation and the persistent, rhythmic roar of the Pacific Ocean as it battered the volcanic coastline. The southern hemisphere moon, occasionally obscured by shifting, dark clouds, cast long, spectral shadows through the towering coconut trees. These trees, standing like silent, rigid sentinels, formed a labyrinthine canopy, creating tunnels of darkness that were both familiar and alien to the inhabitants of the island. It was into this dense, unforgiving wilderness that Topu disappeared, his body perfectly adapted to the terrain, his movements fluid and near-silent against the backdrop of the jungle's nocturnal symphony. He was a creature of his environment, utilizing every shadow, every shift in the wind, and every contour of the landscape to mask his presence as he began his patient, methodical pursuit. Sake, meanwhile, walked with the unsuspecting ease of a man who believed the world was still ordered exactly as he had left it. He navigated the narrow, uneven pathways that wound through the coconut groves, his mind likely preoccupied with the night's successes and the mundane realities of his journey back to the neighboring region of Lyon. He had no reason to suspect that he was being followed. The confidence that had fueled his victory at the gambling table now served to blind him to the very real, very lethal danger closing in on his position. He was a man in motion, his stride steady, his attention focused on the path ahead, completely oblivious to the fact that he was walking toward the final destination of his existence. Every step he took brought him deeper into the trap, closer to the point where his path and the path of his pursuer would converge in a definitive, violent, and permanent collision. Topu tracked his target with the focus of a hunt, his senses heightened, his internal clock tuned entirely to the movements of his prey. He kept his distance, ensuring that he remained safely within the cloak of the darkness, while maintaining constant visual contact with the unsuspecting figure ahead. He witnessed the subtle cues of Sake's journey, the way he adjusted his stride over the uneven terrain, the way he occasionally stopped to listen to the sounds of the forest, the rhythmic, steady pulse of his progress. For Topu, each passing moment was a tightening of the psychological and physical noose. He was not merely waiting for an opportunity. He was orchestrating the circumstances of the encounter, ensuring that when the moment finally arrived, there would be no possibility of failure, no chance for the victim to comprehend his predicament, and absolutely no opportunity for intervention. The patience he exhibited during this pursuit was terrifying, a testament to the depth of his resolve and the absolute, unwavering clarity of his lethal intent. The environment of the coconut grove provided the perfect stage for the unfolding tragedy. The canopy above was dense, blocking out the light of the moon and plunging the path into near-total darkness. The only sounds were the soft, crunching steps of the men on the dry palm leaves and the distant, constant murmur of the ocean. The atmosphere was one of profound, expectant silence, as if the landscape itself were holding its breath, awaiting the inevitable explosion of violence. Topu moved through the shadows with a practiced, feline grace, his familiarity with the grove serving as his greatest ally. He knew the paths, he knew the cover, and he knew the precise moment when the opportunity would become absolute. As they neared a particular intersection within the dense trees, a location where the darkness was deepest and the isolation most profound, Topu realized that the game of pursuit was finally drawing to a close. He emerged from the shadows at a distance so short it defied standard human interaction. It was the point-blank range of a man who did not want to miss, a man who required the absolute certainty of a direct, fatal strike. There was no confrontation, no final, dramatic exchange of words, and no plea for mercy from the victim. There was only the sudden, jarring appearance of the shotgun, the metallic glint of the barrel catching a sliver of stray light before being leveled squarely at the center of Sake's chest. The reaction time of the victim, however quick, was utterly insufficient. Before Sake could even process the reality of the threat, before he could raise a hand or scream in recognition, the inevitable outcome was set in motion. Topu pulled the trigger, and the world was instantly and violently redefined. The blast of the shotgun was a cataclysmic sound that shattered the stillness of the night, echoing through the coconut grove with a force that seemed to vibrate through the very ground. The report was deafening, a sharp, concussive boom that sent a jolt of raw energy through the humid air. The physical impact of the discharge was total and absolute. The force of the shot, concentrated in that limited space, struck Sake with the power of a sledgehammer, driving him backward and ending his life before he had the chance to register the physical trauma. He crumpled to the earth, the silence of the grove rushing back in to fill the void created by the shot, though now it was a different, heavy, and final kind of silence. The life that had been so vibrant and so focused on the accumulation of wealth just moments before was extinguished in an instant, leaving only a broken, still figure amidst the roots of the palms. Topu stood over his victim for a fleeting, suspended moment, the lingering smoke from the gun barrel hanging in the still, humid air like a ghost. The silence that followed the shot was heavier, more profound than anything that had come before. It was the silence of a completed act, the silence of a life irrevocably severed. The adrenaline that had sustained him through the planning and the pursuit began to recede, replaced by a strange, hollow sensation of finality. He had achieved his objective. He had reclaimed the honor he felt had been stolen from him. He had silenced the voice that had mocked him. Yet, in that chilling, dark stillness, there was no sense of triumph, only the undeniable, haunting reality of the scene before him. He turned away from the lifeless body of the man from Lyon and slipped once more into the shadows, leaving behind the dark, hidden corner of the forest where the trajectory of 2 lives had been permanently altered. The path back to his life in the village was now shadowed, not just by the trees, but by the weight of the act he had just committed, an act that would trigger a descent into a mechanical, foreign system of justice that neither he nor his community could possibly have anticipated. The silence of the night remained, absolute and indifferent, as the first, vital thread of a long, dark, and historic drama had finally been pulled, setting in motion a sequence of events that would soon lead to the very first hanging in the history of the territory. The darkness of the grove would hold the secret of that night for a short time, but the machinery of the new, colonial law was already beginning to turn, gathering momentum with a cold, calculated efficiency that would soon reach out to claim the man who had pulled the trigger, just as he had reached out to claim the life of the man from Lyon. The courtroom proceedings were not a venue for the exploration of human motive or the complex cultural underpinnings of the conflict, but rather a cold, stage-managed assembly designed to codify the absolute authority of the naval administration. Within the stark, unadorned walls of the facility that served as the temporary seat of American justice, Topu was brought to face a process that he could barely comprehend. To him, the language of the court, the rigid formality of the proceedings, and the absolute finality of the legal terminology were entirely alien, serving only to heighten the sense of profound isolation he felt. The judicial process moved with a chilling, mechanical precision that seemed to completely ignore the fact that a human life was hanging in the balance. Every procedural step, from the formal indictment to the presentation of the prosecution's evidence, was handled with an efficiency that was as impressive as it was deeply disturbing. The naval officials presiding over the case acted with a sense of urgency that suggested they were not merely presiding over a murder trial, but were instead participating in an exercise of establishing dominion. There was no room for the presentation of the historical or social context of the conflict, no space for the defense to argue for the nuances of the situation, and no allowance for the traditional values of the village to be heard within the proceedings. The courtroom was a vacuum, a space in which only the law of the state existed, and within that vacuum, Topu was a man already destined for the void. The evidence against him was presented with a clinical, unyielding focus. The confession of the act, the identification of the weapon, and the overwhelming testimony of the circumstances surrounding the crime were all laid out in a sequence that made any defense seem futile. The attorneys assigned to the case, whether they were cognizant of the broader political implications or not, functioned within a structure that prioritized the swift application of the law over the exhaustive examination of the truth. It was a spectacle of modern, colonial justice being applied in a raw, traditional environment, and the disparity between the two was stark and unsettling. Throughout the trial, Topu remained a figure of profound tragedy, a man caught within a machine that he had neither the power to resist nor the capacity to understand. He was a spectator at his own downfall, observing the unraveling of his life through the prism of a foreign, punitive system. The observers in the courtroom, consisting of both naval personnel and members of the local community, were forced to witness the total, uncompromising collapse of the individual under the weight of the state. The atmosphere was heavy with the silence of those who realized that a precedent was being set, one that would redefine the relationship between the governing power and the governed forever. The judge, an official representing the interests of the naval administration, conducted the proceedings with an icy, detached demeanor that reinforced the sense of distance between the law and the human element it was supposed to regulate. There was no compassion, no leniency, and no recognition of the circumstances that had pushed the young man to such a desperate extreme. The verdict of guilty was not merely a conclusion to the trial. It was a foregone necessity, a milestone that had to be reached to satisfy the demands of the colonial mandate. As the sentence of death was read, the finality of the decision rippled through the room, leaving behind a silence that was more terrifying than the proceedings themselves. It was the sound of a system that had successfully asserted its right to dispose of life, a system that had effectively demonstrated that it was no longer beholden to the ancient, communal traditions that had once defined the existence of the islanders. The reaction of the community to the sentencing was one of profound, muted horror. The people of Etogi, who had once looked to their traditions to mediate the conflicts that were an inevitable part of human existence, now found themselves witnessing the implementation of a punishment that was completely outside their collective experience. The death penalty, carried out through the cold, calculated mechanism of a public execution, was not a part of their cultural history. It was a foreign, imported concept, a terrifying demonstration of the ultimate power of the state. The speed with which the trial had concluded and the terrifying velocity with which the subsequent execution was prepared created a sense of chaotic, unavoidable momentum. The administrative machine was operating with a singular, relentless focus, and there was no mechanism for challenge, no window for appeals, and no opportunity for the intervention of any other, higher authority. The logistical preparations for the execution proceeded with the same chilling efficiency that had characterized the trial, as the authorities sought to finalize the demonstration of their power without delay. The noose, the platform, and the sequence of events leading up to the final moment were all part of a meticulously organized project designed to leave no doubt about the severity of the state's wrath. In the final days before the execution, the island was in a state of suffocating, heightened tension. The news of the impending hanging spread through the villages with a rapid, alarming quality, carrying with it a palpable sense of dread. For those who had been present at the gambling session in Vaetogi, for the relatives of both the victim and the perpetrator, and for the entire population of the territory, the event was a violent interruption of the natural order of things. The state was not merely punishing a murderer, it was, in effect, executing a public demonstration of its sovereignty. The administrative authorities, perhaps convinced that such a display was necessary to prevent future transgressions and to solidify their control, remained unmoved by the weight of the human suffering that their actions were causing. They were operating on a timeline of their own making, a schedule that prioritized the demonstration of control over the preservation of life. The psychological impact on the population was immense, as they were forced to reconcile the presence of this new, foreign, and lethal power with the traditional, communal lives they were accustomed to living. The fear of the state became a pervasive, quiet undercurrent of life, a realization that the rules had changed and that the consequences of stepping outside those rules were no longer mediated by the village council, but by the cold, objective, and punitive hand of the naval administration. The final moments of the trial and immediate steps taken to prepare for the execution were a testament to the absolute indifference of the colonial power toward the local sentiment. Every detail, from the preparation of the gallows to the securing of the site, was handled with an impersonal, bureaucratic exactitude that served only to highlight the distance between the state and its subjects. There was no concern for the closure of the victim's family, nor was there any recognition of the tragedy of the perpetrator's descent. The case had become a tool of policy, a mechanism of control, and a symbol of the transition from the old world to the new. As the final preparations for the hanging were completed, the atmosphere on the island became almost unbearable, a heavy blanket of anticipation that seemed to touch every corner of the territory. It was a period of suspended time, a moment where the entirety of the island's history seemed to be converging on a single point of lethal finality. The tragedy was complete, a narrative arc that had begun with a simple game of chance and was now concluding with a profound and irreversible act of state-sanctioned violence. The legal system had accomplished its primary goal, the removal of a threat and the reinforcement of its authority through the most extreme and final possible means. The hanging would be a moment of transition, a marker that would never be erased from the collective memory of the people of American Samoa. It was a moment where the harsh reality of the colonial occupation was stripped of its veneers and the raw power of the state was laid bare for all to see. The finality of the execution was not just the end of a life, it was the definitive imposition of a new order, a brutal and lasting testament to the transformative power of the law in the service of the state. The life of Topu and the death of Sake had been subsumed into this larger and more impersonal history, their individual struggles lost in the machinery of the administrative juggernaut. The execution of Topu did not merely mark the end of an individual life, it signaled the permanent, visceral arrival of a new legal reality in American Samoa, one that would reverberate through the history of the territory as a haunting, foundational trauma. When the trapdoor finally fell and the rope snapped taut against the weight of a young man who had once been a familiar presence in the village of Vaetogi, it shattered the remaining illusions about the nature of the colonial administration. The 26 days that had elapsed since the murder in the Coconut Grove had been a frantic, relentless march toward this singular, gruesome spectacle. The efficiency with which the state had processed the case, from the initial investigation and the rapid pursuit, through the sterile, performative trial and finally to the scaffold, was never intended to be understood as justice in the traditional sense, but as a deliberate demonstration of supremacy. By acting with such startling velocity, the naval authorities had effectively bypassed any possibility of communal reflection or the application of customary clemency, stripping the event of its human complexity and reframing it entirely as a test of the state's absolute power. This was a moment of profound, irreversible rupture, where the ancient, restorative traditions of FA Samoa were forcibly subordinated to the cold, punitive logic of a foreign bureaucracy. The aftermath of the hanging was defined by an uneasy, pervasive silence that blanketed the island, a silence born not of acceptance, but of a deeply ingrained, burgeoning fear of the new order. The villagers of Vaitogi and the surrounding regions were left to reconcile the rapid destruction of one of their own with the presence of an authority that showed no concern for their ancestral ways. The execution became a permanent fixture of the local consciousness, a grim, historical marker that demarcated the transition from a life governed by familial and chiefly consensus to a life subject to the looming shadow of the naval prison and the hangman's knot. The tragedy of the event was compounded by the realization that there was no institutional recourse, no mechanism within the newly established system to challenge such an extreme and expedited outcome. The state had asserted itself as the final arbiter, and it had done so in the most visible and irrevocable manner imaginable. However, the ripple effects of this speedy justice extended far beyond the shores of Tutuila. The sheer, alarming pace of the trial and execution had not gone unnoticed by those who viewed the American colonial project from a position of legal and moral distance. When word of the proceedings reached the mainland United States, it ignited a flicker of resistance from observers who saw in the case of Topu a gross, terrifying distortion of the principles of due process. One particular lawyer in California, moved by the reports of the 26-day turnaround from crime to capital punishment, felt compelled to take an extraordinary step. He penned a formal, impassioned letter of protest directly to the President of the United States, Calvin Coolidge, seeking to challenge the legitimacy of such a rapid-fire judicial process. This act of protest was an attempt to shine a light on the hidden, dark mechanics of the territory's administrative rule, highlighting the tension between the image of the United States as a beacon of justice and the reality of its colonial actions in the South Pacific. The lawyer's intervention was not just a defense of Topu, for the man was already beyond the reach of any earthly justice. It was an indictment of the system itself, a challenge to the idea that a colonial administration could act with such reckless, punitive disregard for the fundamental tenets of fairness. The letter to President Coolidge stands today as a testament to the fact that the execution did not pass without challenge, even if that challenge failed to change the outcome for the accused. It highlights the deeply troubling nature of the territory's legal evolution, where the pursuit of order was prioritized over the protection of human rights. The incident raised profound, lingering questions that would haunt the administration of the territory for years to come. To what extent was the judicial system being used as a political instrument of subjugation rather than a neutral, restorative force? How much did the desire to civilize the population through fear undermine the very democratic values that the colonial power claimed to represent? The case of Topu of Vaitogi served as a brutal case study in these dilemmas, showcasing the inherent instability and potential for abuse within a colonial system where the law is applied as a blunt instrument of control. The legacy of the hanging was, therefore, not just the loss of a life, but the creation of an enduring and bitter skepticism toward the legitimacy of the foreign legal regime. Looking back, the entire sequence of events, from the fateful game of chance in the flickering lamplight of Vaitogi to the final ITY of the gallows, appears as a dark and tragic allegory for the broader experience of colonization. The murder of Sake was a manifestation of internal pressures and the failure of traditional mechanisms of conflict resolution, but the response of the state was a far greater and more systemic failure. By choosing to prioritize the spectacle of punishment over the pursuit of justice, the administration alienated the very population it sought to govern. The memory of Topu became a ghost in the collective psyche of the islanders, a reminder that their world had changed in a way that made the old methods of honor and accountability dangerously obsolete. The case became a cornerstone of the territory's legal history, not because of its fairness, but because of its excess. It forced the people to contend with a new reality, one where the power of the state was absolute, and where the consequences of error were no longer a matter of personal or communal resolution, but of state sanction. The silence that followed the execution was not the silence of peace, but the silence of trauma. It was a period of adjustment, a dark chapter in the story of the territory that served as a precursor to the modern era. The legal system would continue to evolve, but the shadow of the first hanging would never fully dissipate. It remained a part of the cultural landscape, a story passed down with a somber recognition of the costs of modernity and the inherent danger of power when it is unchecked by mercy or understanding. The legacy of the case is thus a cautionary tale, a mirror held up to the aspirations and the failures of the colonial project. It reminds us that when a foreign system of law is imposed upon an indigenous people, the most dangerous outcome is not just the clash of cultures, but the erosion of the shared humanity that is essential to any functioning community. In the end, the case of Topu of Vaitogi remains a deeply uncomfortable and necessary piece of history, a reminder that the foundations of colonial rule were often built upon the literal and figurative graves of those caught in the gears of a system they could not hope to resist. The memory of that night in the coconut grove and the cold morning of the hanging continues to resonate, a quiet and persistent echo of a tragedy that defined an era and forever changed the trajectory of the island's soul. The search for justice in the aftermath of the crime was always a pursuit of order, never of healing, and in that critical distinction lies the ultimate failure of the entire process. The hanging was a success of the administration's objective, but a profound and lasting failure of its humanity, a legacy that continues to define the complex relationship between the territory and the power that presided over its most pivotal and painful moment of transformation. The final reflection on the case of Topu of Vaitogi necessitates a departure from the narrow confines of the courtroom and an exploration into the broader, lingering scars that such a foundational trauma leaves upon a community's collective memory. If the execution was the physical act of severing a life, the decades that followed served as the process of integrating that act into the historical identity of American Samoa. It is impossible to detach the specific details of the crime, the desperation of the gambling den, the humiliation in the village, and the singular, brutal finality of the shotgun blast from the overarching narrative of colonial imposition. The case exists not merely as a historical footnote, but as a profound case study in the psychological and social costs of rapid administrative modernization. When a society is forced to transition from the fluid, consensus-driven world of indigenous custom to the static, adversarial world of the colonial state, the friction generated by that transition is invariably marked by blood. Topu was not merely an individual who committed a crime. He was an individual who became the focal point for the overwhelming, unstoppable momentum of a changing world, and in that collision, the humanity of both the victim and the perpetrator was consumed by the machinery of the state. The endurance of this story within the cultural memory of the islanders speaks volumes about the impact of the hanging. It is remembered not as a triumph of law and order, but as a moment of profound, unnatural disturbance. In the years following the execution, the presence of the American Naval Administration took on a different, more somber complexion. The fear that had been instilled by the 26-day turnaround from crime to gallows acted as a persistent, invisible barrier between the governing power and the local population. It cultivated a sense of alienation that, while perhaps not always overt, functioned as an undercurrent in all interactions between the inhabitants and the administrative authorities. The story of Topu became a cautionary tale whispered among families, a narrative that framed the arrival of foreign legal systems not as a blessing of civilization, but as an existential threat to the traditional modes of conflict resolution. The trauma was not just the death of the young man, it was the realization that the local council, the family elders, and the ancestral wisdom of the village were no longer sufficient to govern the conduct or the fate of the individual. This realization created a fundamental, irreparable shift in the social contract of the islanders. The role of the distant protest from the California lawyer adds an essential dimension of irony to the narrative. While it provides a sense of vindication to those who find the state's actions morally repugnant, it also highlights the profound powerlessness of the local community. The fact that the most significant formal challenge to the execution came from someone thousands of miles away, someone who had no direct stake in the cultural life of Vaitogi, underscores the extent to which the islanders were isolated from their own justice system. They were the subjects of the law, not its participants. The letter to President Coolidge, while a noble attempt to assert the universality of due process, also reinforces the reality that the islanders were caught in a system where their voices were peripheral and their cultural logic was entirely ignored. The protest was a sterile, legalistic appeal to a distant authority, a process that mirrored the very same bureaucracy that had executed Topu. It confirms that the tragedy was not just the loss of life, but the systemic exclusion of the very people the law was purportedly meant to serve. Furthermore, we must examine the enduring nature of the victim, Sake. In the clinical focus of the colonial investigation, his humanity was reduced to his status as a victim of homicide, a figure whose death served a specific political utility. Yet, the loss of Sake was, in its own right, a catastrophic event for his family and his community in Lyon. His death was the catalyst for an entire cascade of suffering, yet the state's pursuit of punishment seemed to commodify his demise, using it as a pretext for a display of strength. The tragedy of Sake is that his life and his death were ultimately subsumed by the state's desire for control. He did not receive justice in a restorative sense, he received the state's vengeance. This distinction is vital for understanding why the case remains so potent in its sadness. The state's intervention did not heal the wound created by the murder. It infected it with the cold, unfeeling antiseptic of the law, ensuring that the grievance would never be resolved, only punished. The physical site of the tragedy, the coconut groves around Vaitogi, must also be considered a silent witness to the history. Landscapes have a way of holding memory, and the groves where the life of Sake was ended and the fate of Topu was sealed have remained a persistent, if unspoken, point of reference. The natural world, with its cycles of growth and decay, stands in stark contrast to the rigid finality of the gallows. When we consider the humanity of the individuals involved, we are reminded that they were creatures of the sea and the forest, part of an ancient and complex web of life that was suddenly, brutally interrupted. The intrusion of the hangman's knot into this environment was a fundamental violation of the natural order as understood by the people of the territory. The horror of the execution was amplified by the setting. The sterile, mechanical nature of the gallows was completely out of place in the lush, vibrant, and unpredictable world of the South Pacific. In final analysis, the case of Topu of Vaitogi serves as a mirror held up to the darker side of imperial expansion. It reflects the arrogance of a power that believes its systems are not only superior but inherently universal, ignoring the reality that justice is a social product, deeply tied to the context and culture in which it is practiced. By imposing a foreign, punitive regime without regard for the local, traditional frameworks of understanding, the administration ensured that the law would be perceived as an instrument of occupation rather than a tool for the maintenance of order. The speed of the trial, The rigidity of the sentence and the unyielding nature of the execution were all manifestations of a colonial mindset that valued control over communication and punishment over understanding. The tragedy of the case is that it was entirely preventable, and yet it was also entirely predictable, given the fundamental disconnect between the authorities and the population. The historical significance of this case is not defined by the crime itself, but by the systemic failure that surrounded it. It remains a stark reminder that the application of law, when disconnected from the moral and cultural fabric of the community it serves, ceases to be justice and becomes mere violence. The memory of the event persists because it speaks to the fundamental, universal struggle for dignity and the desire for a system of governance that reflects the lived experience of the governed. As we reflect upon the life of Topu and the death of Sake, we are challenged to recognize the limitations of power and the necessity of humility in the face of cultural difference. The execution in 1921 was not a conclusion to a story. It was an opening, a moment where the complexity of the colonial experience was laid bare for all to witness. It remains a story that demands to be told with gravity and, above all, with an awareness that history is not merely a record of events, but a record of the human consequences of those events. The legacy of the case is a heavy one, but it is one that offers a profound lesson on the enduring importance of empathy, fairness, and the recognition of our shared, fragile humanity, regardless of the political structures that attempt to define our existence. The silence of the groves, the echoes of the shot, and the memory of the rope remain as permanent fixtures in the historical consciousness, serving as a reminder that the cost of authority, when purchased through the destruction of the individual, is a price that remains paid long after the tragedy itself has passed into history. The lessons of that distant, difficult year of 1921 are still relevant, a somber echo that reminds us of the fragility of the social order and the profound responsibility that rests upon those who hold the power of the law. The final accounting of the Topu case requires us to look beyond the immediate historical incident and examine the persistent, lingering resonance of such a transformative event within the collective consciousness of a society. When we contemplate the tragedy of 1921, we are not merely looking at a solved crime or a forgotten file in an archive. We are observing the precise moment when the traditional, organic soul of a territory was forcibly grafted onto a rigid, industrial-strength apparatus of colonial justice. This grafting process was not painless, and the scar tissue it created became an inseparable part of the region's identity. The execution of Topu serves as the definitive point of divergence, a historical fault line that separated the era of the ancestors from the era of the administration. In the decades that followed, the story became more than just a recitation of facts regarding a murder and a hanging. It transformed into a parable about the fragility of local autonomy and the crushing weight of external authority. The people of American Samoa, in the long shadow cast by this event, had to navigate a reality where the very definition of justice had been redefined by an entity that did not share their history, their language, or their profound respect for the delicate balance of social honor. The persistence of this narrative is fundamentally tied to the nature of the loss experienced by the community. It was not merely the loss of a young man, but the loss of the possibility that such a transgression could have been reconciled through the ancient, restorative processes of their own culture. By opting for the blunt force of the gallows, the naval administration effectively disenfranchised the community from the process of healing. This alienation was perhaps the most enduring and damaging consequence of the entire affair. When the state takes the responsibility for retribution entirely out of the hands of the community, it creates a void where empathy and collective resolution should exist. This void was subsequently filled by a pervasive, quiet resentment, a realization that the law was not something that protected them, but something that was imposed upon them. The case of Topu remains a powerful symbol of this alienation, a reminder that true justice requires a degree of cultural resonance that was entirely absent in the brutal, 26-day rush to judgment. Furthermore, we must address the enduring legacy of the legal precedent itself. The execution in 1921 established a chilling baseline for how criminal matters were to be handled within the territory. It created an administrative expectation of efficiency that frequently prioritized the appearance of control over the depth of investigation. This precedent, once set, became difficult to overturn, influencing the judicial culture of the region for many years. Subsequent generations of legal officials, operating within the framework established by their predecessors, found themselves burdened by the dark inheritance of the Topu case. It served as a constant, silent benchmark of the administration's readiness to deploy the most extreme measures to ensure compliance. The memory of the hanging was thus woven into the very structure of the legal system, a persistent, mournful reminder of the stakes involved in any interaction with the machinery of the state. It was a structural trauma that shaped the development of the territory's laws and the practice of its courts, ensuring that the ghost of the first execution would always be present in the courtroom. The human element of this story, the grief of the families, the confusion of the neighbors, and the agonizing solitude of the condemned, is often lost in the clinical summaries of legal history, yet it is this human element that provides the story with its persistent, haunting power. To consider the case through the lens of pure history is to miss the profound, visceral heartbreak that occurred in the quiet, isolated corners of Etogi. The families were not merely bystanders to a crime. They were the ones who carried the weight of the tragedy long after the authorities had departed. The story of Topu is, at its core, a story of the destruction of families and the erasure of individual potential, all for the sake of a political demonstration. It serves to humanize the statistics of colonial history, reminding us that every administrative action, every legal ruling, and every instance of state-sanctioned violence has a real, tangible impact on the lives of people who are rarely consulted and often ignored. This is the moral imperative of recounting such a story, to restore the humanity of the individuals involved and to acknowledge the devastating cost of a justice system that is divorced from the people it is meant to serve. As we look back from the vantage point of the present, the case of Topu of Etogi serves as a bridge, connecting us to a period of intense, often painful transition. It is a story that requires us to examine the limitations of our own perspectives and to recognize the dangers of judging the past through the narrow, biased lens of our contemporary values. Yet, it also demands that we hold the authorities of that time accountable for the specific, intentional choices they made. They were not merely caught in the currents of history. They were the ones steering the vessel, and they chose a path that prioritized the exercise of power over the preservation of communal stability. Their failure to engage with the cultural reality of the people they governed was a fundamental oversight that resulted in a lasting, systemic injustice. The memory of their failure, crystallized in the life and death of Topu, stands as a permanent indictment of their colonial arrogance. The significance of the case, therefore, is not found in the crime itself. Violent acts occur in every society, but in the response of the state, which transformed a local tragedy into an act of historic, colonial violence. The hanging was not a solution to the problem, nor was it a necessary measure for the maintenance of order. It was an exercise in performative severity, a message directed at a population that the administration feared and did not understand. The fact that this message was so quickly and decisively sent is what makes the case so disturbing. It reveals a mindset that was fundamentally at odds with the ideals of fairness, compassion, and the sanctity of human life. The case will forever remain a point of departure in the history of the territory, a defining moment that illustrates the profound, often tragic cost of the clash between different modes of existence. Finally, we must recognize that the story does not end with the execution or with the letters of protest. It continues in the ways that the people of the territory have, over the past century, grappled with the legacy of their encounter with the colonial state. The story of Topu has become a part of the cultural tapestry, a narrative that is invoked to discuss the complexities of identity, the challenge of preserving tradition in an era of globalization, and the ongoing struggle for true, representative justice. It is a story that refuses to remain in the past, continuing to provoke questions and demand reflection. It is a narrative of resilience, as much as it is a narrative of suffering, as the people have managed to retain their sense of self despite the best efforts of an administration to fundamentally transform their worldview. The case of Topu of Etogi, with all its darkness and all its sorrow, remains a vital, central component of the historical consciousness, a testament to the fact that power can destroy a life, but it cannot fully erase the meaning of that life from the memory of a community. The echoes of the past, when listened to with care, provide a foundation for the present, ensuring that the mistakes of the 1920s are not simply repeated, but understood as part of a long, difficult, and ongoing journey toward a more equitable and human-centered world. The tragedy remains our own, a mirror reflecting our own capacity for injustice, our own need for understanding, and our own profound, shared responsibility to ensure that the stories of the past are never truly silenced. As we close the account on this, the final reflection of the case, we do so with the somber, resolute understanding that the true, final act of justice is not the punishment of the guilty, but the compassionate, unflinching remembrance of the truth. The conclusion of the narrative surrounding the Topu case requires a final, deliberate synthesis of the historical, sociological, and moral threads that have been meticulously unraveled throughout this extensive examination. As we step back from the specific details of the 1921 tragedy, we are left with a sobering portrait of a society at an irreconcilable crossroads. The execution of Topu stands as a permanent, immovable monument to the fundamental clash between two incompatible philosophies of existence, one rooted in the communal, restorative traditions of the Pacific Islands, and the other governed by the rigid, adversarial, and frequently punitive structures of Western colonial administration. To view this history merely as a true crime account is to fundamentally misunderstand its weight. It is, in the most profound sense, a record of the human consequences that occur when an external power seeks to impose its own version of truth and order upon a culture that has existed for centuries under its own internal laws. The speed of the process, the calculated nature of the state's retaliation, and the silence that followed the hanging all contribute to a narrative that is as much about the failure of colonial empathy as it is about the tragic personal decisions of the individuals involved. When we consider the broader implications of the case, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice, in the context of the American colonial project, was often performative. The authorities were not merely adjudicating a homicide, they were signaling the end of an era. The swiftness with which they moved from the crime scene to the gallows served as a blunt, unmistakable message to the indigenous population that their traditional mechanisms of settling disputes, the village councils, the family mediations, and the concept of restitution, were no longer the primary governing forces of their lives. This systemic shift was not a subtle transition. It was a violent imposition of authority that rendered the old ways of navigating communal conflict suddenly, and perhaps dangerously, obsolete. The trauma of this shift was not simply in the act of execution, but in the realization that the power to judge, to punish, and to erase had been irrevocably transferred to an entity that viewed the Samoan people through a paternalistic and often indifferent lens. This is why the case continues to carry such a heavy, dark resonance. It was the moment when the people of the territory were forced to acknowledge the true, precarious nature of their new reality under the naval administration. The role of the California attorney's protest, while significant for its moral clarity, also serves to illuminate the profound isolation of the islanders. The fact that the most articulate, formal opposition to the state's actions came from someone outside the territory underscores the extent to which the native population was structurally silenced. Their lack of representation, their inability to participate in the very system that claimed to govern them, and the disregard for their traditional social structures all contribute to a narrative of profound disempowerment. The protest was a necessary, noble, but ultimately ineffective gesture, serving primarily to underscore the stark imbalance of power that defined the colonial relationship. It highlights that, even in the most flagrant instances of judicial overreach, the systems designed to provide oversight were often as detached and unresponsive as the systems that committed the acts themselves. This reality is a central, recurring tragedy in the history of the territory, providing a bleak context for the legal developments that followed in the subsequent decades. In evaluating the victim and the perpetrator, it is essential to maintain a perspective that avoids the pitfalls of romanticization or reductionism. Sake was a man of the region, an individual who likely operated with a degree of worldly confidence that was, in the end, his undoing. Topu was a product of his environment, a young man whose sense of honor was the prism through which he understood his own identity and worth. Their fatal intersection was a result of a tragic, combustible mixture of personal pride, financial desperation, and cultural misunderstanding. The tragedy is that their deaths and the subsequent destruction of their lives became the foundation for a political narrative they neither sought nor controlled. The state's intervention in their private conflict did not bring resolution. It brought only the sterile finality of the gallows, leaving the underlying tensions and the deep, communal wounds entirely unaddressed. The memory of their tragedy is not a lesson in the success of the law, but a warning of the catastrophic results of substituting vengeance for true restorative justice. As we bring this exploration to its conclusion, we must consider the responsibility that we, as observers of history, have toward the stories of the past. To retell the case of Topu is not to resurrect the violence for the sake of entertainment, but to honor the truth of what transpired, ensuring that the human cost of these historical processes is not lost to the indifference of time. It is a responsibility to acknowledge the pain of the families, the trauma of the community, and the profound, chilling reality of a power that can, with the stroke of a pen and the pull of a lever, terminate a life for the sake of its own authority. The story of Veitogi is a mirror that forces us to examine our own capacity for understanding, our own commitment to fairness, and our own recognition of the inherent, inviolable dignity of every human life, regardless of the systems that attempt to categorize, judge, and erase them. The legacy of the case, therefore, is not a settled matter. It remains a live, vital component of the historical consciousness, a narrative that continues to evolve as new generations re-examine its lessons and its meanings. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of the law to the heart of the community, to demand a form of justice that is not merely efficient and punitive, but one that is fundamentally, deeply, and persistently human. The trauma of 1921 continues to echo, a persistent, mournful note in the melody of the territory's history, reminding us that every administrative act leaves a residue, every legal verdict has a weight, and every instance of state violence carries a debt that is paid by the community long after the event itself has faded from the headlines. The memory of the execution, with its grim, systematic coldness, serves as a barrier that prevents us from falling into the trap of complacency regarding the history of our own systems of power. Ultimately, the case of Topu stands as a profound, cautionary testament to the limits of governance when it is divorced from the people it claims to serve. It underscores that the legitimacy of a system is not derived from its ability to punish, but from its ability to foster understanding, to resolve conflict through a process that respects the dignity of all parties, and to hold itself accountable for the impact of its decisions on the lives of those it governs. The tragic failure of the naval administration to meet this standard in 1921 remains a central, defining, and deeply regrettable aspect of the territory's past. As we close this extensive reflection, we do so with a heightened awareness of the fragility of the social order and the profound, enduring responsibility that rests upon those who hold the power to decide the fate of others. The story of Veitogi is one that we must carry forward with gravitas, not because it provides a satisfying conclusion, but because it refuses to be finished, continuing to demand that we strive for a more equitable, empathetic, and truly just approach to the complexities of human interaction. The echoes of that morning, with the silence of the coconut groves and the weight of the noose, are a permanent, haunting reminder of our shared, fragile, and ongoing responsibility to honor the truth of our past, ensuring that the lives lost in the pursuit of power and the imposition of order are never truly forgotten. The final judgment of history is not found in the gallows, but in our continued, dedicated commitment to ensuring that the tragedy of that day is understood, remembered, and never permitted to repeat itself, serving as a permanent, cautionary beacon in our collective journey toward a more humane and understanding future. In this, the final analysis, the story of Topu of Veitogi lives on, not as a symbol of death, but as a persistent, urgent, and essential call for the protection and preservation of the humanity that unites us all, across all divisions of culture, history, and law. The final contemplation of the Topu saga necessitates a synthesis of the historical, sociological, and moral threads that have been meticulously unraveled throughout this extensive examination, serving as a terminal reflection on the case's enduring significance. As we step back from the specific details of the 1921 tragedy, we are left with a sobering portrait of a society at an irreconcilable crossroads. The execution of Topu stands as a permanent, immovable monument to the fundamental clash between two incompatible philosophies of existence, one rooted in the communal, restorative traditions of the Pacific Islands, and the other governed by the rigid, adversarial, and frequently punitive structures of Western colonial administration. To view this history merely as a true crime account is to fundamentally misunderstand its weight. It is, in the most profound sense, a record of the human consequences that occur when an external power seeks to impose its own version of truth and order upon a culture that has existed for centuries under its own internal laws. The speed of the process, the calculated nature of the state's retaliation, and the silence that followed the hanging all contribute to a narrative that is as much about the failure of colonial empathy as it is about the tragic personal decisions of the individuals involved. When we consider the broader implications of the case, we are forced to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice, in the context of the American colonial project, was often performative. The authorities were not merely adjudicating a homicide, they were signaling the end of an era. The swiftness with which they moved from the crime scene to the gallows served as a blunt, unmistakable message to the indigenous population that their traditional mechanisms of settling disputes, the village councils, the family mediations, and the concept of restitution, were no longer the primary governing forces of their lives. This systemic shift was not a subtle transition. It was a violent imposition of authority that rendered the old ways of navigating communal conflict suddenly, and perhaps dangerously, obsolete. The trauma of this shift was not simply in the act of execution, but in the realization that the power to judge, to punish, and to erase had been irrevocably transferred to an entity that viewed the Samoan people through a paternalistic and often indifferent lens. This is why the case continues to carry such a heavy, dark resonance. It was the moment when the people of the territory were forced to acknowledge the true, precarious nature of their new reality under the naval administration. The role of the California attorney's protest, while significant for its moral clarity, also serves to illuminate the profound isolation of the islanders. The fact that the most articulate, formal opposition to the state's actions came from someone outside the territory underscores the extent to which the native population was structurally silenced. Their lack of representation, their inability to participate in the very system that claimed to govern them, and the disregard for their traditional social structures all contribute to a narrative of profound disempowerment. The protest was a necessary, noble, but ultimately ineffective gesture, serving primarily to underscore the stark imbalance of power that defined the colonial relationship. It highlights that even in the most flagrant instances of judicial overreach, the systems designed to provide oversight were often as detached and unresponsive as the systems that committed the acts themselves. This reality is a central, recurring tragedy in the history of the territory, providing a bleak context for the legal developments that followed in the subsequent decades. In evaluating the victim and the perpetrator, it is essential to maintain a perspective that avoids the pitfalls of romanticization or reductionism. Sake was a man of the region, an individual who likely operated with a degree of worldly confidence that was, in the end, his undoing. Topu was a product of his environment, a young man whose sense of honor was the prism through which he understood his own identity and worth. Their fatal intersection was a result of a tragic, combustible mixture of personal pride, financial desperation, and cultural misunderstanding. The tragedy is that their deaths and the subsequent destruction of their lives became the foundation for a political narrative they neither sought nor controlled. The state's intervention in their private conflict did not bring resolution. It brought only the sterile finality of the gallows, leaving the underlying tensions and the deep, communal wounds entirely unaddressed. The memory of their tragedy is not a lesson in the success of the law, but a warning of the catastrophic results of substituting vengeance for true restorative justice. As we bring this exploration to its conclusion, we must consider the responsibility that we, as observers of history, have toward the stories of the past. To retell the case of Topu is not to resurrect the violence for the sake of entertainment, but to honor the truth of what transpired, ensuring that the human cost of these historical processes is not lost to the indifference of time. It is a responsibility to acknowledge the pain of the families, the trauma of the community, and the profound, chilling reality of a power that can, with the stroke of a pen and the pull of a lever, terminate a life for the sake of its own authority. The story of Etogi is a mirror that forces us to examine our own capacity for understanding, our own commitment to fairness, and our own recognition of the inherent, inviolable dignity of every human life, regardless of the systems that attempt to categorize, judge, and erase them. The legacy of the case, therefore, is not a settled matter. It remains a live, vital component of the historical consciousness, a narrative that continues to evolve as new generations re-examine its lessons and its meanings. It challenges us to look beyond the surface of the law to the heart of the community, to demand a form of justice that is not merely efficient and punitive, but one that is fundamentally, deeply, and persistently human. The trauma of 1921 continues to echo, a persistent, mournful note in the melody of the territory's history, reminding us that every administrative act leaves a residue, every legal verdict has a weight, and every instance of state violence carries a debt that is paid by the community long after the event itself has faded from the headlines. The memory of the execution, with its grim, systematic coldness, serves as a barrier that prevents us from falling into the trap of complacency regarding the history of our own systems of power. Ultimately, the case of Topu stands as a profound, cautionary testament to the limits of governance when it is divorced from the people it claims to serve. It underscores that the legitimacy of a system is not derived from its ability to punish, but from its ability to foster understanding, to resolve conflict through a process that respects the dignity of all parties, and to hold itself accountable for the impact of its decisions on the lives of those it governs. The tragic failure of the naval administration to meet this standard in 1921 remains a central, defining, and deeply regrettable aspect of the territory's past. As we close this extensive reflection, we do so with a heightened awareness of the fragility of the social order and the profound, enduring responsibility that rests upon those who hold the power to decide the fate of others. The story of Etogi is one that we must carry forward with gravitas, not because it provides a satisfying conclusion, but because it refuses to be finished, continuing to demand that we strive for a more equitable, empathetic, and truly just approach to the complexities of human interaction. The echoes of that morning, with the silence of the coconut groves and the weight of the noose, are a permanent, haunting reminder of our shared, fragile, and ongoing responsibility to honor the truth of our past, ensuring that the lives lost in the pursuit of power and the imposition of order are never truly forgotten. The final judgment of history is not found in the gallows, but in our continued, dedicated commitment to ensuring that the tragedy of that day is understood, remembered, and never permitted to repeat itself, serving as a permanent, cautionary beacon in our collective journey toward a more humane and understanding future. In this, the final analysis, the story of Topu of Etogi lives on, not as a symbol of death, but as a persistent, urgent, and essential call for the protection and preservation of the humanity that unites us all, across all divisions of culture, history, and law, finally grounding our understanding of justice in the soil of human experience rather than the abstract ink of state statutes. The legacy left behind is not merely one of loss, but of an enduring mandate to listen to the whispers of the past, to respect the sanctity of human dignity above all administrative convenience, and to forever hold the machinery of power to the highest standard of moral accountability. By doing so, we ensure that the lessons carved into the history of Etogi are not just remembered, but integrated into the very marrow of our ongoing efforts to build a world where the tragedy of 26 days is viewed not as a triumph of order, but as a cautionary shadow that we have collectively chosen to outgrow, learning to value the restorative power of compassion over the cold, mechanical silence of the scaffold. The profound resonance of the Topu case, examined across the expansive arc of this narrative, reveals itself not merely as a historical relic, but as an active, living component of the territory's ethical landscape. To dwell upon the finality of this saga is to confront the uncomfortable reality that justice, when stripped of its cultural context and accelerated by the demands of colonial expediency, ceases to be an instrument of reconciliation and becomes instead a stark mechanism of political dominance. The events of 1921 on the island of Tutuila demonstrate that the imposition of a foreign legal framework is never a neutral or purely administrative act. It is, at its core, an act of cultural erasure that prioritizes the stability of the state over the complexity of human life. As we look back upon the chilling velocity with which Topu was moved from the darkness of the coconut grove to the terminal point of the gallows, we are forced to grapple with the realization that the system was never designed to account for his humanity, nor the humanity of the victim's sake. Instead, both men were subsumed into a broader, colder agenda that sought to assert the supremacy of the naval administration, transforming a tragic, personal conflict into a public spectacle of obedience and terror. This realization serves as the definitive indictment of the administrative mindset of the era, showcasing a disconnect so profound that it rendered the language of law a hollow, ineffective mask for the raw, unadulterated exercise of power. The enduring silence that followed the execution, as well as the later, desperate attempts by distant observers to appeal for fairness, illustrate the profound isolation felt by the local population in the face of such a monumental violation of their social contract. It was a silence that spoke volumes, a defensive, necessary response to a power that had demonstrated its willingness to terminate the life of a young man with such calculated indifference to the nuances of his personal circumstances. The legacy of this event is, therefore, one of profound, lingering distrust, a skepticism toward the legitimacy of any legal authority that does not take the time to listen, to mediate, and to understand the deeply embedded, traditional values that have sustained a community for generations. To understand the story of Veitogi is to understand that the tragedy was not a failure of law, but a failure of leadership, a failure of imagination, and a failure of empathy. It reminds us that the primary purpose of a governing system should not be the swift, punitive removal of a transgressor, but the creation of an environment where conflict can be resolved in a manner that restores, rather than destroys, the delicate fabric of the community. As we move forward in time, the case continues to function as a cautionary benchmark for all those who hold the power to shape the legal and social evolution of territories under foreign or administrative control. It demands that we consider the human cost of efficiency, asking whether the speed of a trial or the severity of a punishment is ever truly worth the erosion of moral authority that occurs when justice is perceived as a tool of oppression. The narrative of Topu, with its dark, inextricable links to the broader history of American influence in the South Pacific, challenges the presumption that a civilized law can be superimposed upon a traditional society without profound and lasting consequences. It asks us to rethink the very foundations of justice, emphasizing that true legal integrity is entirely dependent on the capacity for mercy and the willingness to recognize the shared dignity of those caught within the gears of the system. The story of Veitogi serves as an eternal reminder that the history of law is also a history of human struggle and that every verdict carries the weight of the principles upon which it is built. Looking ahead, the commitment to remembering this tragedy with the necessary gravity and nuance is a essential task for those who seek to build a more equitable and just future. By keeping the story of Topu alive, not as a mere cautionary warning but as a profound and persistent call to conscience, we acknowledge the inherent danger of power when it is unchecked by the realities of the governed. This involves a dedication to hearing the voices that were suppressed and understanding the cultural logic that was dismissed during the rapid assembly of the administrative court. The goal is not merely to critique the past, but to build a more inclusive and restorative legal paradigm that respects the diverse ways in which human beings interpret their rights and responsibilities. The hanging was a moment of profound darkness, but the subsequent century of reflection is a process of bringing that darkness into the light, ensuring that the lessons of that difficult era inform the choices we make today and tomorrow regarding the nature and the purpose of authority. As we bring this series of reflections to a close, we must reaffirm the necessity of such work, acknowledging that the act of honest historical engagement is in itself a form of justice. It is an act of redress, a way of balancing the scales of memory and ensuring that the human cost of colonial rule is never relegated to the margins of our collective understanding. The legacy of the case of Topu of Vaitogi remains a fundamental component of the territory's identity, a reminder that even in the face of overwhelming power, the truth of an event can be preserved and reflected upon with dignity and clarity. The final act of this long and complex narrative is our shared commitment to ensure that the tragedy of 1921 is never permitted to fade from the living record of the island or from the conscience of those who seek to walk in the path of a more enlightened and humane administration. Our responsibility is not merely to remember the crime, but to engage with the conditions that made such a tragedy possible and to work tirelessly toward a future where the inherent dignity of every individual is held as the paramount and inviolable principle governing the application of law and the pursuit of justice. Thus, we reach the conclusion of this exhaustive examination of one of the most haunting and significant chapters in the legal history of American Samoa. The path from the flickering lamps of Vaitogi to the cold, clinical finality of the gallows has been a long and arduous journey through the history of a territory caught in the vice of rapid colonial change. By meticulously documenting the descent of Topu and the tragic end of Sake, we have attempted to provide a record that honors the reality of the past while providing a framework for understanding the profound structural failures of the administrative regime of the time. The narrative has been one of deep, persistent, and ultimately human focus, centering on the experiences of the individuals trapped in a system that had no room for their complex, traditional identities. As we lay this record to rest, we do so with the profound, lingering understanding that history is not a static list of dates and legal decisions, but a dynamic and deeply meaningful process of learning from the failures of those who came before us. We carry the memory of the 1921 tragedy not as a burden but as a beacon that lights the way for all those who seek to ensure that the pursuit of order never again comes at the total expense of the human soul. The final legacy of Topu, therefore, is an ongoing and vital conversation about the meaning of liberty, the necessity of respect, and the eternal vigilance that is required to maintain a truly just and compassionate order in a world that is always defined by its differences and its deep and enduring search for equity. The story of Vaitogi continues, woven into the fabric of the islands, a silent, persistent reminder that the most significant lessons are often those born of the most profound and avoidable tragedies, and that our collective, ongoing commitment to learning from these stories is the most powerful tool we possess for building a future that is, at last, worthy of the humanity we all share. The finality of this 12-part examination leads us to a profound synthesis of the entire Topu narrative, where the historical specificities of the Vaitogi tragedy coalesce into a broader reflection on the nature of institutional power and human fragility. Over the course of this extensive journey, we have dissected the mechanics of a colonial legal imposition, tracing the path from the humid, tension-filled atmosphere of a village gambling den to the sterile, calculated violence of the scaffold. This narrative has served as more than just a documentation of a singular murder case. It has functioned as a deep, structural analysis of how systems of authority navigate, or fail to navigate, the complex realities of an indigenous culture in transition. By centering our focus on the collision between the ancestral, restorative logic of the Samoan people and the cold, adversarial statutes of the United States Naval Administration, we have sought to reveal the underlying architecture of a colonial project that prioritized administrative dominance over the preservation of communal integrity. The case of Topu stands not merely as a crime, but as a symbolic intersection where the past and the future of the territory met in a collision of irreconcilable forces, leaving in its wake a legacy of trauma that has persisted in the collective consciousness for more than a century. As we look back, it is essential to acknowledge that the swiftness of the 1921 judicial proceedings was the primary instrument by which the administration asserted its absolute control. By compressing the timeline from the initial transgression to the finality of execution into just 26 days, the state effectively denied the community the space required for traditional mediation, for the cooling of passions, and for the engagement of the deeper, spiritual, and social hierarchies that had governed the islands for centuries. This velocity of justice was not a feature of a robust legal system, but rather a characteristic of a fledgling colonial regime that felt itself to be in a constant state of precariousness. To move that quickly was to demonstrate, both to the native population and to the external observers in Washington, that the law was no longer a matter of communal consensus, but a matter of state-sanctioned force. The tragedy was thus not merely the loss of 2 lives, but the rapid, mechanical erosion of a cultural paradigm that had understood justice as a mechanism of restoration rather than a mechanism of punishment. This transformation, carried out with such relentless efficiency, ensured that the wound caused by the initial conflict would never be truly healed, but instead would be frozen in time, serving as a permanent, cautionary marker of the cost of administrative modernization. The persistent resonance of this case in the modern era is a testament to the fact that such foundational violations of cultural autonomy are never truly resolved. They are merely integrated into the historical and ethical identity of a territory. The story of Topo has become a parable of loss, a narrative that is invoked when discussing the limitations of outside intervention and the importance of respecting the local, indigenous frameworks of governance. It highlights that the legitimacy of a law is not solely found in its technical application, but in its resonance with the moral values and the social realities of the people it governs. When that resonance is absent, the law risks being perceived as an occupation rather than an administration, and every subsequent action taken by the state is viewed through the lens of that initial, catastrophic failure of understanding. The case teaches us that for any legal order to be truly enduring and respected, it must engage with the reality of its subjects with humility, patience, and a recognition of the inherent, fragile dignity that resides in every human life, regardless of how far from the centers of political power that life is lived. We must also recognize the moral imperative that arises from the retelling of this story, the responsibility to prevent the simplification of history for the sake of convenience or political narrative. It is all too easy to cast the actors in this drama as mere archetypes, the victim, the murderer, the colonial judge, but to do so is to strip away the very humanity that the case so tragically highlights. Topu was a man driven by a desperate, misplaced need for the preservation of his honor in a world that was changing too fast for him to grasp. Sake was a man whose worldliness and confidence rendered him blind to the lethal, social undercurrents he was navigating. And the administrative officials were individuals operating within a paradigm of colonial duty that blinded them to the human wreckage they were creating in the name of order. By resisting the temptation to categorize these individuals and instead focusing on the complex, systemic pressures that converged upon them, we gain a more nuanced and, ultimately, more profound understanding of why such tragedies occur. This, in turn, provides the necessary wisdom to ensure that the mistakes of the past are not simply repeated in the future. The journey we have taken through these 12 parts of the narrative reflects the complexity of the events themselves. It has been a process of peeling back the layers of a historical moment to reveal the core of human experience that lies beneath the records of the naval courts and the bureaucratic correspondence. As we conclude this reflection, We do so with a clear-eyed recognition that while the events of 1921 are long in the past, their lessons are acutely relevant to the ongoing project of navigating cultural differences and the exercise of power in the modern world. The commitment to fairness, to the protection of individual rights within a communal context, and to the unwavering recognition of the humanity of the marginalized remains the fundamental, unfulfilled promise of any system that claims to dispense justice. If the Topu case has one ultimate, enduring message, it is that the measure of a society is found not in its capacity to punish, but in its ability to reconcile, to understand, and to extend mercy even when the pressures of order and the demands of state authority are at their most intense. As the memory of the events of Veitogi continues to persist in the stories of the islands, we are reminded that history is a living document, constantly being reread and reinterpreted by new generations who bring their own questions, their own moral frameworks, and their own hopes for a more just future. This narrative of Topu and Sake, of the coconut grove and the gallows, of the village and the administration, remains an essential part of that document, a chapter that refuses to be closed or simplified. It is a story that invites us to listen to the voices of the past with a heightened sensitivity to the complexities of their struggle and a profound appreciation for the sacrifices that were made in the often brutal process of defining the nature of governance and the limits of the law. We conclude this long and arduous investigation with the sober awareness that the quest for justice is never truly finished, but is instead a constant effort to refine our institutions to better reflect the complexity of the human condition. May the memory of the lives that were lost serve as a beacon of conscience for all who work to build a world where the dignity of the individual and the integrity of the community are held as the highest and most sacred principles of the law. The story of Topu lives on not in the shadow of the gallows, but in the light of our shared understanding that every human life is of infinite value and that our efforts to govern ourselves must always be anchored in the profound and enduring search for equity, empathy, and justice. With this final reflection, the record of the Veitogi tragedy finds its place among the lessons that define the territory's identity, ensuring that the cost of authority is never again paid in the currency of unnecessary and systemic destruction, and that the promise of a more compassionate future remains the primary driving force behind all our collective endeavors to understand the complexities of our shared and deeply interconnected human journey as we move forward into a future where the lessons of the past are not just remembered, but are actively used to foster a more just and humane world.